Today we're going to finally get to see all of our weeks and weeks and months of going through the book of Isaiah begin to pay off in one of the most beautiful stories Isaiah has to offer. So let's get to it. Hello everybody and welcome back to our Prophet series, part 22. My name's David Tate.
And my name's Brienne.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. And Brienne, it is good to have you back.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if Brienne's going to be back with us every week, but the way that our schedule worked out is that she was able to be with us today. And so she's here for us to go through Isaiah chapters 36 and part of Isaiah 37.
Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited for this chapter.
Yeah.
Before we go into this, though, real quick announcement. What are my announcements? Oh, first off, if you want access to these slides, you can get it at nowletsbehonest.com/resources. They're absolutely for free. Mm-hmm. And if you would like to support us on Patreon, you can do that at patreon.com/David Tate. That is not free. But, yeah, thank you so much. Real quick, will you open us up in a word of prayer, and then we're just going to hop right into the book of Isaiah.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
all right.
Absolutely. Lord, we thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to come together and study your word that you have so graciously given us, even over this platform where it's kind of over this form of media, something that's so different but so cool that we're able to use it as a way to glorify you. We pray that as we go into the study that you open our minds and our hearts to the wisdom that you have available for us, and that we can use this information as a way to go out and shine our light to others, to glorify you in all that we do. We thank you for all that you are and all that you've done for us, Lord. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so today we are going to be covering Isaiah chapter 36, verse 1 through 37, verse 20, which means that next week we're actually going to be covering a fairly short portion of Isaiah, so we might have a shorter video, but it also could just be that we get to go a little bit more in depth, which is really cool. But today we are going to talk about Hezekiah's faith, and if you don't know who Hezekiah is, you will by the end of this video, and you'll probably think he's a pretty cool guy. But real quick, what I wanted to do is something a little bit different than we've been doing in the past videos, partially because Brienne is here, and so since she hasn't been here for the past few videos, I figured we'd spend a little bit extra time on context, but also because I really want us to understand this book really well, and in order to understand it well, I kind of want to draw some different parallels, and I want to draw some attention to the structure of the book so that you get more out of the subject we're actually going through today.
And it's the culmination. So
yes.
that helps.
Yeah. We're kind of reflecting more on what we've covered so far in order to really understand where Isaiah is leading us at this point in the story. And so what you see at the top of the slide is kind of the outline we've been following so far through the book. And Isaiah is 66 chapters long, but this is specifically the outline for the first 39 chapters. And this is stuff that we've covered multiple times throughout the series, so I'm not really going to break this one down as much. But what I put this up here for was to contrast it with this other outline that I kind of just created, which is another way we can kind of view these 39 chapters. Because in the original outline, we kind of broke down that chapter 1 was really just the introduction to the book as a whole, and then really chapters 2 through 12 are all these prophecies concerning Judah and Jerusalem, and we kind of had this funneling out process where Isaiah was addressing bigger and bigger audiences, right? So he's talking about Judah and Jerusalem, then he talks about the surrounding nations, then he talks about the entire world, and then he kind of goes back towards Judah and Jerusalem with the book of woes, and then ultimately leading into the stuff we're covering today. I want us to look at it in a slightly different way now, though, because that is one way you can look at this book, because really all of these different structures really do work. But another way to look at this is really like one big sandwich, right? Where chapters 1 through 6 of the book are really just one big introduction to Isaiah's message, right? So you have the opening lawsuit, you have some introductory chapters which are just kind of covering God's problem with Judah and Jerusalem at this time period, and then chapter 6 is the calling of Isaiah. Right, so really chapters 1 through 5 were probably written later on, but Isaiah put them at the beginning just because they are an introduction to the book. And then he is finally called in chapter 6, and that really sets the whole book in motion. And starting in chapter 7, we have this story that is more in a narrative format, where Isaiah confronts somebody about some different stuff. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But he confronts them, and that ultimately leads into this long list of prophecies that is exactly following the structure we've already talked about, right? He starts talking about Judah and Jerusalem, then he expands out to talk about the surrounding nations, and then ultimately he talks about the entire world, and then ultimately goes back to that whole Book of Woes thing that we just finished last week, right? And the Book of Woes has primarily been talking about why the people of Judah should not go down to Egypt seeking help, but rather they should trust in God. And then that leads us to these final 4 chapters that we're going to be covering over the course of the next few weeks, which is really kind of the culmination of really chapters 1 through 39 of the book of Isaiah. Because really, chapters 1 through 39 and 40 through 66 are, in a way, 2 different books. They are in many ways unified as well. I'm actually going to do a whole video covering that because there are some people who think that 2 different people wrote the book of Isaiah. And we're going to cover that in a little bit. I personally think that Isaiah wrote the whole thing, but we'll talk about that a few weeks down the road. But that's because chapters 1 through 39 and 40 through 66 really are vastly different in many ways. And so as we approach chapter 39, we're reaching the end of this really big narrative movement that Isaiah's been taking us through from chapter 1. I know this sounds really boring. I know this does not sound like exciting stuff for Bible study, but if you look at it this way, it'll actually help you understand what we're going through a little bit better. And this is why. So, back whenever we got through chapter 7, right? So chapter 6 was the calling of Isaiah. Chapter 7 is really where the book began to be set in motion. And that started off with Isaiah confronting King Ahaz in 735 BC, telling him to trust in God rather than in Assyria. And this is where the Emmanuel prophecy was given, right? This is the part where, if you remember it, pretty famous passage, typically not for the reasons that Isaiah would have it be famous, typically because we like quoting this in regards to the Messiah, and rightfully so. But basically, Isaiah confronts King Ahaz at this pool. And he shows up at the pool, he confronts Ahaz, and he says, hey, here's the deal. At the time that Ahaz was reigning, the Assyrians were kind of growing in power, and they were starting to make their way through everywhere, destroying there. And the Syrians and the Israelites, so the northern kingdom of Israel and Syria, they had been asking Ahaz for help so that they could kind of form a coalition to take on the Assyrians. Ahaz didn't want to do that. Ahaz actually was going to go to Assyria for help in order to fight back against the Syrians and the people of Israel. And so Isaiah confronted Ahaz and was like, hey, don't do that. You need to trust in God. Don't trust in Assyria. And he says, I'm going to give you this sign. The young woman shall give birth to a son, and you shall call him Emmanuel, and he will represent God being with his people, right? And back in that video, we talked about how that also applies to the Messiah, stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the main thing you need to remember from that is that they had this meeting at this pool, and Isaiah confronted him and said, who are you going to trust? Are you going to trust in the foreign nations, or are you going to trust in God? I know that sounds boring because we're recapping all this stuff, but now we have to look at where we're going to be today. Today, we're going to be starting off in chapter 36, which begins with Assyria confronting Hezekiah in 701 BC, right? So about 34 years later, Hezekiah is the son of Ahaz. So Ahaz was the king of Judah near the beginning of Isaiah's ministry. 30 years later, his son Hezekiah is now the king. Hezekiah is a pretty young guy at this point, I believe. And Hezekiah is going to be confronted by the Assyrians at that very same pool where Isaiah formerly confronted Ahaz, right? So we definitely have this narrative parallel taking place in the book of Isaiah. We have these 2 confrontations at this pool, father and son, about 30 years apart. First, Isaiah confronts Ahaz and says, hey, are you going to trust God or are you going to trust in man? Now we have the Assyrians approaching Hezekiah, and they're going to say, are you going to trust in God, or are you going to be trusting in man? So the Emmanuel prophecy was given back in 735 BC, and now we're going to really see it being put to the test. We're going to see, did Hezekiah learn from his father's mistake? And then, if you look at all the stuff that happened in between, chapters 8 through 35, Yahweh proclaims his sovereignty over not only Judah, but the entire world. He declares his judgment against the wicked, yet promises an eternal righteous kingdom to those who trust in him. In light of the growing Assyrian opposition, the people of Judah are warned to trust in Yahweh rather than in Egypt, right? So that is basically a concise summary of everything we've covered in the book of Isaiah so far. And like I said, I know that sounds really boring going into it, but if you think of things this way, it's going to really pay off as we actually go into the text.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of talking. I promise I'm going to let you talk at some point.
No, it's all good.
But I'm kind of just trying to get everybody caught up here because it's really crucial that you understand all these different things because it'll really help you get the most out of this book.
Yeah.
That being said, what do you say? Should we actually get to the biblical text?
Let's do it.
All right. So I'm going to read this for us, and then maybe we'll see if we can get some of your thoughts.
Okay.
All right. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. And the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army. And he stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. And there came out to him Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder. All right, so right off the bat, what do we have going on here?
So kind of what we were talking about before, it seems like it's kind of parallel to what's happening before with, what was his name again?
Ahaz?
Yes, with Ahaz.
Yes.
So we have Assyria, which we know is against the people, and they're coming to kind of confront the people and kind of see, what's going on. And they're going to that same, like a pool, the upper pool.
Yeah, and we even have the same structure for how it starts out, because originally the other one, I think it said in the first year of Ahaz, or in the whatever year of Ahaz. Right here we have in the 14th year of Hezekiah. That lets us know exactly when this was. The other one was 735 BC. This one is 701 BC. This means that Hezekiah began to reign in 715 BC, though he must have served as a co-regent with his father Ahaz from 729 to 716 BC, since 2 Kings 18 has him begin his reign in 729 BC. He reigned until 686 BC. You don't need to remember those dates. Those are not important. I mainly have that information there just for you to be aware of. But yeah, so Hezekiah has been reigning for about 14 years, and he's going to be reigning for another about 14 or 15 years after this as well. But in this 14th year in particular, this is where everything with the Assyrians really comes to a head. And we have been talking about the Assyrians for weeks and weeks and weeks as we've been going through the book of Isaiah, because the Assyrians have been really the big bad guy from the very beginning. And so Sennacherib, or Sennacherib, I don't really care how you pronounce it, he shows up. He's the king of Assyria. He reigned from 705 BC to 681 BC, and he was known for devastating not only Judah, but really all the land along the way from Assyria down there. He was just conquering everywhere, but he devastated pretty much all of Judah and left only Jerusalem free. But things are going to begin to change right around here, because he is coming for Jerusalem as well. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them, right? So he's just taking them out one after another.
Yeah.
And the king of Assyria sent the Rabshakeh from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem with a great army. Rabshakeh was just a chief cupbearer, but this was specifically a high-ranking official who is here serving as an official spokesman. He came from Lachish, which was 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem, and we're going to see that place mentioned again later on in this story. But yeah, so this is where we start really seeing the parallels with Isaiah chapter 7, right? He stood by the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. This is the same place Isaiah confronted Ahaz over 30 years earlier in chapter 7 to discourage him from trusting in foreign powers. Will Hezekiah learn from his father's mistake? I think that's the really big question here. And that's what Isaiah is wanting you to wonder, right? So we have this same exact confrontation. Formerly, it was the prophet confronting Ahaz saying, hey, you need to trust in God rather than in man.
Yeah.
Now we have the Assyrians showing up, and Hezekiah is being forced to make that decision. Will he trust in God or man?
Yeah.
Obviously, Hezekiah is not here in this particular scene, but the information is going to be relayed to him, and then we're going to have to see how that plays out, right? And there came out to him Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph the recorder. Shebna is actually a person we've talked about earlier in the book of Isaiah. He was not exactly a favorable person. I'm not really going to spend a lot of time talking about him right now, but he was mentioned earlier, just in case y'all were wondering. Okay, but could you read the next little paragraph for us there? Because we're going to start moving into the meat of this in a second.
And the Rabshakeh said to him, say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Syria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? And whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? Behold, you are trusting in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Such is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. But if you say to me, we trust in the Lord our God, it is not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar. Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I will give you 2,000 horses if you are able on your part to set riders on them. How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants, when you trust in Egypt for chariots and for horsemen? Moreover, it is without the Lord that I have come up against this land to destroy it. The Lord said to me, go up against this land and destroy it.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. I've got to say, I really like Rabshakeh's speeches here, mainly just because he is a cocky guy. He's cocky, but also he's got a very interesting case, and we're going to see that the stuff he says is not entirely wrong. It's just that his motivation is wrong.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to be interested to see what your opinions are here. I've always found this story very interesting, and also just it's worth noting, if I don't have this stuff uploaded quite yet onto my website when you go to the resources page, but whenever I do have this uploaded, you'll be able to see that I've actually added some extra slides at the end of this whole thing that actually includes the parallel passages that we read of the same exact story, both in 2 Kings and in 2 Chronicles. Because really, a lot of the stuff from this book of Isaiah is word for word found in 2 Kings, which has led some people to think that maybe Isaiah was the author of 2 Kings, or maybe that Isaiah got this from 2 Kings. Like, people have kind of debated about which one came first, right? It's like the chicken or the egg. Because a lot of this is word for word. But every time I encounter this story, it's very interesting, and I really like it. But the fact that it's repeated at 3 different places in the Bible shows that it's probably significant, right? And so real quick, I'm just going to read the little summary thing I have here at the bottom, and then I'm going to ask your opinions on just all the stuff that Rabshakeh has to say.
Okay.
So first off, Rabshakeh states that 1, Egypt cannot help Jerusalem, and secondly, Yahweh had called the Assyrians to destroy Judah. That's really what he's saying down there at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Is it without the Lord that I have come up against this land to destroy it? He says that Yahweh actually told him, go destroy the land of Judah. Much of what he says reflects Isaiah's own words to the people as well. If you actually look into the earlier chapters of Isaiah, you'll see that this is exactly what Isaiah says. He says, hey, guys, God is going to send the Assyrians to destroy you if you're not trusting in him. And so the things that Rabshakeh is saying is like, yeah, I mean, technically it's true. He mistakenly thought that Hezekiah had torn down altars to Yahweh when really those were the altars of pagan gods, because worship of Yahweh was reserved for the temple. All right, so he says, didn't Hezekiah tear down those high places? Well, really, Hezekiah was tearing down the altars to the pagan gods. So Hezekiah was doing a good thing, but Rabshakeh is misinterpreting that. It is likely that he was speaking from pride when he suggested that Yahweh had sent them to destroy Judah, but those who had heard Isaiah's words knew that, from one perspective, this was technically true. Right? So he's speaking like in a very cocky and proud manner, and we know from the book of Isaiah that God does not like people who speak in such a way, but technically he's not wrong. And so what do you think about Rabshakeh and all the different stuff he has to say here?
I think it's interesting because there definitely is validity behind what he's saying, but he's kind of twisting it for his own benefit, which is just interesting kind of how he does that, because he talks about how, like, leaning onto Pharaoh and leaning onto Egypt is not a good thing, and they shouldn't do that because they're not reliable and they can't help them, and God would agree with that. And then he talks about what we were saying before, that, you know, God sent them to come and destroy them, which we saw that Isaiah told them that if they're not going to follow what God says, then he can use anyone that he wants in order to his glory to show through however he needs to. He can use whether it's his people or other people in the surrounding areas, because God can do really whatever he wants. So it's cool how he's saying stuff that's right, but at the same time you're like, that's a little sketchy at the same time. So
well, that really is the irony behind the whole thing. Because what he's saying is correct, but his motive for saying it is wrong. Because God himself says, yeah, Egypt can't help you. But the reason why Egypt can't help them is because God is the one behind the Assyrians helping them destroy Judah.
Right.
And so his whole point is saying, you need to trust in me because I am stronger than Egypt and I'm stronger than Assyria.
As he's proven before.
Exactly. The reason why the Rabshakeh is saying it, though, is because he thinks that in and of themselves they're powerful enough. Right? He's not giving Yahweh credit for their power. He's simply saying that Yahweh sent them on the mission, which I already have questions about that. I want to know what were the Assyrians'
What were the
relationship to
words?
Yahweh, right?
Yeah,
Like, how was
yeah.
it that they knew this? How did they know that the God of Israel sent them?
What was it, the exchange of dialogue or anything like
Yeah,
that?
I would really be interested to know that, but we just don't have that information. But okay, let's just kind of walk through this a little bit more slowly. We're not going to go totally in depth because we just don't have time for that.
Yeah.
But, so Rabshakeh said to them, say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria. So notice how he doesn't even call Hezekiah king, but he calls the king of Assyria the great king, the king of Assyria. So
Yeah.
we have already,
Titles.
he's kind of putting Hezekiah down and elevating the king of Assyria. On what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you now trust that you've rebelled against me? Right? So he's saying, do you think, like, because basically diplomacy, right? Because Hezekiah sent these messengers out and he says, what, you think words are going to get you out of this war? You've rebelled against me. And this goes way back to Ahaz, right? Because Ahaz originally was trying to trust in Assyria, and Isaiah's like, no, don't do that. And so now Assyria is looking at it like rebellion, and they're like, we're coming and we're going to destroy you.
Yeah.
Behold, you are trusting in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff, which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. Right? So the idea is that you're over here trying to rely on Egypt to help you, but all they're going to do is end up hurting you.
Right.
Because they really can't do it. Like, they're so incompetent that in trying to protect you, they're going to hurt you. So he's really just making fun of Egypt, which technically, once again, is true. Egypt can't help them, but not for the reasons he's thinking.
Yeah.
He's thinking that Assyria is just the most powerful thing. The reason
Right.
Egypt can't help is because God is allowing Assyria to be more powerful. Such is the Pharaoh king of Egypt to all who trust in him. But if you say to me, we trust in Yahweh our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar? So he says, if you're saying that you trust in God, doesn't look like it. And once again, technically he is true.
Yeah.
That's the whole reason Isaiah has been getting onto the people, because they're not trusting in God. But his reasons for saying it, once again, are flawed. Like, that's what I love about the nuance of Isaiah, because all the things Rabshakeh is saying are technically true from an external perspective. Yes, Egypt is not strong enough. Yes, the people are not worshiping God. Yes, Assyria is being told by God to do this stuff. But he's misinterpreting everything.
Right.
The whole point is that Egypt is purposely not able to help because God is supposed to be the only one who can help. The reason why Hezekiah told him to tear down the altars is because he's trying to lead a reformation and trying to get people to trust in God. Right? So it's not actually like, those were not altars to Yahweh. They were altars to other gods.
Right.
And so he's like, y'all don't look like y'all are trusting in God. And Isaiah's like, yeah, that's what I've been telling them. But Hezekiah's been trying to change that. Come now, make a wager with my master, the king of Assyria. I'll give you 2,000 horses if you're able on your part to set riders on them. How then can you repulse a single captain among the least of my master's servants when you trust in Egypt for chariots and horsemen? He says, here, I'll make a deal with you. Surrender to us. I'll give you whatever you want. And so he's really just trying to barter with them. Hey, come on. Come to my side. Don't trust in Egypt. Trust in us.
Right.
He's just kind of trying to,
Very confident.
Yeah. Moreover, is it without the Lord that I have come up against the land to destroy it? The Lord said to me, go up against the land to destroy it. He says, guys, even if you are trusting in Yahweh, which I don't think you are, but even if you were, he's the one who told me to come do this.
Right.
And so once again, technically, he's right. But the way he's saying it is like, yeah, God knew that I was the only one fit for the job. That's why he told me to do it. It's almost like God is gaining something from Assyria.
Yeah.
Whereas really, God has employed Assyria to do this job, not because God needed them, but just because he was disciplining his people. So Rabshakeh is just totally misinterpreting this.
Right.
But okay, let's move on to the next part. Then Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah said to Rabshakeh, please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall. But the Rabshakeh said, has my master sent me to speak these words to your master and to you, and not to the men sitting on the wall, who are doomed with you to eat their own dung and drink their own urine? Once again, this is just kind of, these are just manly men.
Yeah.
Just trying to lay down the law and try to flex on one another.
Yeah.
So what happens here is that Hezekiah's representatives didn't want the people to overhear Rabshakeh's words and think that God truly was on Assyria's side, which is ironic because technically God was kind of on Assyria's side here.
Right.
Hence why they request him to speak in Aramaic, the language of diplomacy. However, Rabshakeh seemed to enjoy destroying their morale, so he continued speaking in Hebrew. What do you think about that?
It seems to be, like, from what we know about Rabshakeh so far, it seems to be consistent with his character. Just by what he was saying, like, in the previous slide, he seems like someone who would just continue on talking like that. He seems very confident. And, yeah.
Well, and the thing is, he's making a pretty convincing case.
Right.
And that's why these people are asking him to change languages. Because you can just imagine all the other people, you know, like all the soldiers camped around on, like, the walls of Jerusalem and stuff. They're, like, shaking in their boots right now. They're like, wait. He's right. Like, we can't trust in Egypt, and we haven't been trusting in God, and we did tear down those high places, and if God told him to come destroy us, that does sound a lot like what Isaiah said.
Yeah.
Yikes. Maybe we are wrong. And, like, they're losing their morale, and so they're like, oh, hey, could we just, like, switch languages? Because you're kind of discouraging our troops here. And Rabshakeh's like...
They're getting down from the wall.
Yeah. Rabshakeh's like, yeah, that's kind of the point. I'm trying to... make you realize that we're more powerful than you.
Right.
And so it really is just kind of funny. It's funny just because of his character. Then the Rabshakeh stood and called out in a loud voice in the language of Judah, right? So you have the emphasis. It's in the language that everybody speaks because he is really trying to just tear them down here. And this is what he says. Hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in Yahweh by saying, Yahweh will surely deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Syria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then each one of you will eat his own vine, and each one of his own fig tree, and each one of you will drink the water of his own cistern, until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you by saying, Yahweh will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? What do you think there?
So he continues having a pretty convincing argument for the people, especially if the people weren't already trusting in God or already kind of weren't wanting to listen to Hezekiah. Someone coming in and saying these things, especially whenever he's promising them things of prosperity, which is very similar to things that God promised them. If they're wavering in their faith and they're not strong and confident in who God is and who his character is, this would be a very convincing thing. If they're just sitting there and they're kind of almost looking death in the face, and someone comes in from the other side and says this, they'd probably want to take it pretty quickly, especially if they're just not trusting in Yahweh.
Yeah.
So.
And I gotta be honest, I'm pretty sure that Rabshakeh's just blowing smoke here.
Oh, yeah.
Like, the stuff he's saying, from their perspective, I 100% agree with you.
Did the king of Syria actually tell you to say that?
Yeah. Like, from their perspective, I 100% agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
I don't think that he's planning on doing any of this stuff,
No.
right? He's
Just
planning
making
on
an
totally
argument.
destroying them. But he's kind of just being like, guys, if you surrender to me, we'll give you everything you've ever
Your
wanted.
heart's desires.
Yeah. He's trying to lure them in. Really, he's doing what Satan does, right? He's trying to appeal to them and so that they fall for
Fleshly
it.
desires.
And really, he's just saying, don't trust in Egypt, trust in us.
Yeah.
But the whole point is you can't trust in anything. And really, to go back to the whole confrontation with Ahaz moment, the thing that Isaiah was telling Ahaz was saying, don't trust in Assyria, right? Because at that time, Ahaz was actually trying to trust in Assyria.
Right.
And so really it is coming full circle in a totally different way, because they're saying, trust us, we'll make things better for you, which is probably the same thing that they were saying to Ahaz 30 years earlier.
Yeah.
But you know what happened in between those 30 years? They have totally destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel. The northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed in 722 BC. And so right in between these two, these decades, northern kingdom, it's gone. Right? They have been taken off and they're wiped out, and we still don't know where those people are at.
Right.
They have never returned. The northern kingdom is gone. And so it's like, I think we kind of already have an idea of what Assyria is planning here. And so we don't really have very good reason to trust in what Rabshakeh is saying.
Yeah.
But it is really fun. So Rabshakeh promised that the great king of Assyria would abundantly provide for them, but that the lowly King Hezekiah could not provide for them, nor could their God. He suggests that Yahweh is no more powerful than any of the other gods, so they shouldn't trust Hezekiah when he suggests that they trust in him. Which goes back to exactly what you were saying. Very convincing argument, right? He's like, none of the other gods could stop us. What makes you think that your God is so spectacular? And notice how we're still waiting for Hezekiah's response.
Right, yeah.
So far, Hezekiah hasn't even shown up on the scene. We have just seen Rabshakeh saying, don't let Hezekiah say to trust in God. And the other people are like, obviously, Hezekiah's servants and the messengers, they don't seem to be trusting in God very much. But we still don't know how Hezekiah is going to respond. And so that's really the tension that we're waiting for here. But I really like Rabshakeh's speeches here, just because it's so arrogant and so pompous, and it's just setting himself up for failure.
Yeah.
Right? He says, hear the words of the great king, the king of Assyria. Thus says the king, don't let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Don't let, whatever Hezekiah says, if he says that there's some way out of this, he's lying to you. There's no way for you to be delivered. Don't let Hezekiah make you trust in Yahweh by saying Yahweh will deliver us. This city will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. He's saying, not only can Hezekiah not save you, God can't save you either.
Yeah.
Notice his tonal shift. A few verses ago, he was saying that Yahweh's the one who sent him. But now apparently he's saying, oh, we're more powerful than Yahweh. So now his true colors are beginning to show.
Right.
You know, but he's still speaking very diplomatically. Don't listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria, make your peace with me and come out to me. Then each one of you will eat his own vine, and each on his own fig tree. Each will drink the water of his own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. The irony of all this is like, okay, if you're just going to give us what we already had,
then why take anything?
Yeah, why take anything at all? Why not just leave us here? It's like, yeah, so it's like, yeah, well, I'm going to give you a land like your land. But you see how he's trying to step into the place of God?
No, yeah, he's promising them things. I mean, it's similar to whenever God's first giving them the promised land. He's like, I'm bringing to you a land flowing with milk and honey.
Yeah.
It's like all of the things you could possibly want. It's like, is there provided for you in that land? And he's trying to do kind of the same thing.
Yes. No, he's doing exactly that. And you kind of highlighted that earlier. Yeah. But it's literally just what God promised the people of Israel, Assyria is now promising them.
Which, it's also interesting, which these people, if they're wavering their faith, they're not going to like figure this out. But before he comes in and he says that God's the one who sent them, which would seem like, okay, that means that, you know, like you and God were in communication, y'all had exchanging of like thoughts, of dialogue, whatever that may be. And then he comes in and he's saying he's more powerful than God. So then you're like, hold on a second, weren't you just like, you were just talking with him? Like, so like, do you trust in him? Or like, no, you don't trust in him, because now you're saying that you're more powerful than him. And now you're saying that you can like give all of these things to the people that God would give to them. So it's just, it's like, it's this very like weird thing where he's kind of trying to like put himself in the place of God, but then he's also claiming that he's like working with God at the same time. But I don't think they would catch that if they're just thinking from like fleshly desires or from the outside perspective and like in the moment of adrenaline of these people coming to like tear down their land. But anyways.
And what I really love about this is that it really is bringing everything we've talked about in the book of Isaiah to a big culminating point, right? Because now we have literally Assyria showing up and promising the people exactly what God promised them. And the question is, who are they going to trust? Are they going to trust Assyria, or are they going to trust God? Are they going to go to God and seek deliverance, or are they going to seek Egypt for deliverance, right? So literally all of these different plot threads are converging right in this story. And we're trying to figure out, what decision have the people come to? Is God with them, or is he not, right? Emmanuel, God with us. That's really what this all revolves around. Is God with them? He's saying, don't let Hezekiah tell you that God's with you. Don't let him say that God will deliver you, because God can't deliver you. And it's like, well, is he going to, or is he not? That's what it's all culminating in. Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you by saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Right? They're gone. Where are the gods of the Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Right? Samaria represents all of the northern kingdom of Israel. They're demolished. Samaria, totally gone. Israel is gone. He says they weren't able to stop us. And technically, the northern kingdom was supposed to be worshiping Yahweh as well. Right? In theory, but they weren't. Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? Convincing argument. He says, hey, we have gone through all of this same old song and dance. We have taken out every other god. And so now you've got to decide, do you really think that your God's more powerful than us?
Right.
Because everybody else thought their God was more powerful too.
Yeah.
And so it really is putting them between a rock and a hard place. Are they going to trust in God, or are they going to trust in man?
Yeah.
Because everything the Assyrians are saying here are very convincing.
Yeah.
It's like,
especially in the moment.
yeah. And because the rest of Judah has been lost. Jerusalem is pretty much the only thing left at this point. And it's like, I don't know. Do we trust in, like, what is Hezekiah going to do? Like, the tension is there.
Yeah.
Because you're saying, okay, Isaiah's been we know as the reader what they're supposed to do.
Right.
We know for a fact they're supposed to trust in God because God can do this. And if we've been reading the book of Isaiah correctly and we've been listening to Isaiah, we know that it's like, yeah, like God did do, like you're able to read between the lines and figure out what Rabshakeh's doing. But we also know that the people of Isaiah's time period are spiritually blinded.
Yeah.
And they're spiritually deaf and they're not listening. And so you're like, what are they going to do? And it's a really big moment. And it's really tense.
Yeah.
And so we move on. But they were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. Then Eliakim, son of Hilkiah, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and Joah the son of Asaph, the recorder, came to Hezekiah with their clothes torn, and told him the words of Rabshakeh. Finally, we get to Hezekiah here.
Dun, dun, dun.
So, having anticipated Assyria's ultimatum, Hezekiah had apparently instructed his advisors not to respond. They returned to him and offered the report in a state of grief and mourning. Right? So they show up with all their clothes torn. They got sackcloth, ashes on. And I think this is a smart move on Hezekiah's part, right?
Definitely.
He sends them out there and says, don't make any decisions. Hear what he has to say, and then report back to me. And I'll make the final decision. So that's what they're doing. And like, if you're reading this, like, and you're just experiencing it, and you have in mind, like, what Isaiah said to Ahaz 30 years earlier, you're feeling the tension. And you're saying, okay, this will be a sign for you. Like, because we know that, like, Isaiah, like, the original fulfillment of the Emmanuel prophecy was Isaiah's son, right? Maher-shalal-Hashbaz, right? It was the idea that Isaiah did have that son, and that was the sign God is with them. So we know that God is with the people. But is Hezekiah going to respond in the same way, or is he going to bow down to the convincing arguments of the Assyrians?
Yeah.
Now we go into chapter 37. As soon as Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went into the house of the Lord. And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amoz. They said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this day is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. It may be that Yahweh your God will hear the words of the Rabshakeh, whom his master the king of Assyria has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that Yahweh your God has heard. Therefore lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. I've got to say, Hezekiah's response is pretty good.
It's a good response.
What do you think about it?
So there's definitely this tension that's building this entire time, and you're wondering, I mean, there's a lot that weighs on this, if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, northern Israel is destroyed. We have Judah here, and they're literally, like, basically looking death in the face. They have been confronted, and they have this choice. And for one, I think it's interesting that the choice that they have to make, it's not necessarily, I mean, it is an obvious one, but it's not something that's like an easy choice, I guess you'd say, because there's convincing arguments. It's not like something that's completely unappealing to where you'd be like, well, why would I accept that one over trusting in God? There's these different appealing arguments that surround, and it's a test of their faith to figure out who are you going to choose to serve today, that type of thing. And so this tension is building, and you're finally wondering, okay, Hezekiah sent these people out, and he's saying don't respond, and so you're hoping that whenever they get back that Hezekiah is going to respond with, you know, a smart response. And it comes back and he does. And you're like, yes, this is what we need. So it's a good climatic moment, I think.
And this is really, kind of goes back to what you were saying at the beginning of that. This is a big moment in the sense of this is a history-defining moment.
Oh, yeah.
Because we've seen in the earlier chapters of Isaiah what's going to happen to them if they don't trust in God. He says, I'm going to send you off into exile, and I'm going to have Assyria destroy you. And instead, the people of Judah, they're going to last another about 150 years before they're destroyed again, before they're actually finally destroyed by Babylon. But we know that God was saying, if you don't repent, I'm going to let Assyria destroy you. And so by Hezekiah making the right choice here, he is single-handedly
Yeah.
saving all the people, and he is pushing their discipline off by
Right.
really like another 100 plus years.
Mhm.
And so this is a really cool history-defining moment.
Yeah.
History as we know it would be radically different if it were not for Hezekiah's choice here.
Mhm.
So it's really, really cool. So Hezekiah responds properly by mournfully going to the house of prayer. That's what Isaiah is going to call the temple in chapter 56. So once we get to the back half of the book. That is the temple to pray and seek forgiveness for sin.
How cool.
There is not a more appropriate way,
Mhm.
right? And so for the first chapter, really, chapter 36 was all building up to this moment where they finally approach Hezekiah, and that's where chapter 36 ends. They approach Hezekiah, they tell him what's going on, and then you go to chapter 37, you're wondering, how is he going to respond?
Yeah.
Like, this is going to affect things largely.
Mhm.
And it says, as soon as King Hezekiah heard it, he tore his clothes and covered himself with sackcloth and went to the house of Yahweh.
It's like a sense of urgency.
Yes.
It's like that's the initial response. There's
Yeah.
no question about it. That's
He
really cool.
like what he doesn't just say, guys, go back out there and say we surrender.
Mhm.
He doesn't immediately respond politically.
Mhm.
Instead, his first response is to tear his clothes, go into mourning, and approach God in the temple.
Mhm.
And he says, what Isaiah has done has come true.
Mhm.
And he sent Eliakim, who was over the household, and Shebna the secretary, and the senior priest, covered with sackcloth, to the prophet Isaiah, son of Amoz. Second thing, really important that he did, he sent to Isaiah. Because as soon as he hears what Rabshakeh is doing here, Hezekiah recognizes what's happening.
There's fulfillment.
He
going
says,
on.
this is exactly what Hezekiah said would happen.
Mhm.
And the people have not been listening to Isaiah, right? We know that because God said the people are not going to listen to you. They're just not going to hear you. They're going to be spiritually blinded, spiritually deaf. But Hezekiah calls for him because he's probably got all these other prophets who have been saying, don't worry about the Assyrians. You got all these false prophets.
Right.
But Isaiah's been saying exactly this was going to happen.
Mhm.
And so he says, get me Isaiah.
Mhm.
He calls Isaiah forward. And they said to him, thus says Hezekiah, this is a day of distress, of rebuke, and of disgrace.
Mhm.
He admits this is not a good day for
Right.
Judah. We should not have come to this point. Children have come to the point of birth, and there is no strength to bring them forth. That's a bit of a difficult thing to break down, but this is what he's saying.
Mhm.
As a woman incapable of delivering her child, Hezekiah admits that he is incapable of delivering Jerusalem and Judah from her distress.
Yeah.
If they are to survive, they are utterly dependent upon Yahweh,
Mhm.
right? Children have come to the point of birth, and there's no strength to bring them forth. He says, here we are. He is viewing the people of Judah as his own children.
Yeah.
He is the mother, right? And he says, they're right here, and I want to save them, but I don't have any more strength.
Yeah.
Right? So he has torn his clothes. He says, I have done everything I can, and now I realize that I need somebody to come help.
Yeah. And how interesting that is worded like that here, because from the previous slide we saw Rabshakeh saying that the Lord can't help them, that he can't do anything.
Yep.
By Hezekiah's power, he can't help, and by God's power, he can't help them either.
Yep.
And so now you have this where he's admitting that he can't do anything alone, but God can if he intervenes.
Yep.
That's really cool.
And I just thought of this to go back to the prophecy about Emmanuel, talking about the parallels. A young woman shall give birth to a son. So a woman, specifically if you're taking the virgin interpretation, a woman who literally is incapable of bringing a child forth on her own will be aided by God to bring forth a child.
Interesting. Yeah.
If you think about it that way, it's like, whoa, that's exactly what's being said here, right? Hezekiah is saying, I can't bring forth this child alone. I need God to help deliver it. That's exactly what happens with the Emmanuel thing, right? First, you have the early interpretation, like the immediate one with Isaiah's kid, but then literally whenever Mary gives birth to Christ, literally a woman who could not give birth on her own, God enables to give birth to a child, right? And so the parallelism really just works there. He says this, it may be that Yahweh your God will hear the words of Rabshakeh, whom his master, the king of Assyria, has sent to mock the living God, and will rebuke the words that Yahweh your God has heard. Therefore, lift up your prayer for the remnant that is left. I like that Hezekiah doesn't say, God's going to do it. He's just saying, maybe God will listen. He's not coming at this with he doesn't have a mindset of entitlement. Yeah. He says, he's really admitting we don't deserve it.
Yeah.
He's just saying, maybe. And he goes to Isaiah and says, if he's going to listen to anybody, it's going to be you. Like, Isaiah, if you go pray, Like, just pray for the remnant that's left, because the rest of Judah has been kind of destroyed. They're down to Jerusalem. And he says, Isaiah, we should never have gotten to this point. Pray for who's left, because God might be willing to hear. And if he hears, and he hears the mockery that this guy's saying, he's not going to be silent. And if God is willing to hear our prayer, he will save us, and he can save us. And so Hezekiah is responding in a beautiful way. He has totally received the message. He's like, yes, God is with us, or he's at least saying God could be with us. If God is willing to listen, right? The question isn't like, can God be with us, or can God win? He says, no, of course God can be with us, and of course God can win. It's just a matter of whether or not it's too late. Like, have we taken too long to repent?
Right.
And so he's not doubting God at all. If anything, he's doubting themselves, right? He's saying, you know what? Maybe we waited too long. But if God's willing to hear us, then Assyria will fall. Really cool response.
Yeah,
like,
it's a great
Hezekiah
response.
is just killing it right here. When the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah, Isaiah said to them, say to your master, thus says Yahweh, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. What's really cool about this is that you notice how Isaiah didn't even have to mutter the prayer. It just says, when the servants of King Hezekiah came to Isaiah. So they were coming to Isaiah to deliver this message.
And he already had it ready for him.
And Isaiah was like, yes, that's exactly what God was expecting you to say. Yahweh gives Hezekiah the same advice that he gave his father. Do not be afraid. Right? Way back in chapter 7, Isaiah stood before Ahaz and says, do not be afraid. Right? The young woman shall give birth to a son. Like he's saying, don't be afraid. God will be with you. Emmanuel. You don't have to worry. Same message to Hezekiah here. God will be with you. So God has not changed. The people have been changing. They have fluctuated up and down. God has stayed the same. He promises that Sennacherib will return home and be killed back in Assyria, which is exactly what is going to happen. The Assyrians would be to Hezekiah just as Syria and Israel had been to Ahaz. All talk, no action. At the time of Ahaz, the Syrians and the Israelites, or the people of Israel, they had been threatening to attack Judah, and that is why Judah had been seeking help from Assyria. But God said, you don't have to be afraid of them. They're just going to be all talk, no action. They're not going to end up doing anything. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Syria and Israel, they never ended up doing anything. They ended up going away. Same exact thing happening here. This is why I wanted to break down the outline at the beginning, because if you really notice the parallels between chapter 7 and this chapter, it really ties all things together, and you can see how Isaiah is really bookending this section of his book. The Assyrians would be to Hezekiah as Syria and Israel had been to Ahaz, all talk, no action. Thus Judah would know that God was with them, Emmanuel. Right? So it all goes back to that single word, Emmanuel. Isaiah said to them, say to your master, thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words that you have heard, with which the young men of the king of Assyria have reviled me. So God did hear. It's funny because Hezekiah's over here saying, maybe God will hear. And God's like, I've been listening the whole time. I didn't miss any of it. I was just waiting for you to respond. It's a beautiful portrait of who God is.
Right.
Behold, I will put a spirit in him, so that he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land. So what do you think about all this?
Well, for one, I think it's cool. It highlights God's character, and we see how he stays consistent and he stays the same no matter what the people do in their fluctuating ways. But then I also think it's cool to see how just one person can make such a big difference. You have all of the people of Judah who are pretty much almost wanting to go with the Assyrians and take up their offer. Thankfully, they go back to Hezekiah and they follow his instructions to not answer them there. But it takes this beautiful portrait of Hezekiah coming and bowing down and praying to God. And God hears and he listens. Not that he wasn't listening before, but he hears this prayer, and that changes the whole trajectory, the whole course of just their history in general. And that's just really cool that just one person humbling themselves before the Lord can do something like that.
Well, and a really big important part we need to notice with all this is that Hezekiah is a son of David, right? He is the anointed one, right? He is the
chosen one.
He is the Mashiach, right? The Messiah of his time period, right? He is not the capital M Messiah as in Jesus,
Right.
but he is the Lord's anointed. He is a son of David, and so he is fulfilling that role, right? Where he is kind of the mediator between God and man at this point. And so it really is a beautiful thing whenever you see that. Like, the king and his actions dictate what the people are like.
Yeah.
And that's what we see throughout all of like 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles and stuff. The way that the king relates to God dictates how the rest of the people relate to God.
Yes.
If the king is faithful, the people will be faithful. If the king is not faithful, the people will not be faithful either. And so the leaders represent all the people.
Yes.
And so that's really one beautiful thing about like just how God created authority structures. Because he's pointing us towards Christ and what Christ does. Christ is the true son of David, who is really the righteous one, and through him we are made righteous, right? And so it really is cool how through one man's intercession and faithfulness, an entire people are spared.
Yeah.
Really cool.
Crazy.
Okay, we reach our final little slide here. The Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah, for he had heard that the king had left Lachish. Now the king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, he has set out to fight against you. And when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah, saying, Thus shall you speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah. Do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. And shall you be delivered? Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nations that my fathers destroyed? Gozan, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, the king of Hena, the king of Eva? To me, what? What were you going to say?
He hasn't backing down, that's for sure.
No.
He's just continuing. And I think it's really funny, again, because he tried to almost paint the picture that he aligned with God, but then he compares God to all of these false gods, which should bring like this like huge red flag up to the people of Judah, which, again, their faith is wavering. But it's to Hezekiah. I mean, he's strong there. But like that is a huge red flag that he's like, well, where is this God and where is that God? Well, it's like, well, our God isn't like those gods. Like, ours is the one true God. Ours is Yahweh. These are false gods that we've always been told not to worship. So I just think it's funny how he approaches that.
Yeah. One thing that kind of cracks me up about this is it seems like Rabshakeh is running out of arguments, right? He's kind of just repeating the same thing, because I think usually at this point people would have given in.
Right.
And now, he's like
scratching his head.
He's like, I guess I'm just going to repeat myself because you're not getting the point. But it's also because I think he's starting to get nervous, right? Because what he hears here, with Egyptians advancing from the south, that's what he hears. When it says Tirhakah, king of Cush, Cush is Egypt, right? So he hears that Egyptians are coming.
Yeah.
So they're advancing from the south, and this is the thing that Assyria feared most, and which the people of Judah had come to rely upon, right? That is what Isaiah was warning against. Don't trust in Egypt. They can't save you. But from the Assyrians' perspective, that's the last thing they wanted Judah to do, because Egypt is the one people who could have possibly done anything. Right? That's why Judah was tempted to trust in them. Right?
Yeah.
They was like, hey, if anybody can help us, it's Egypt.
Yeah.
And Assyria knew that.
Yeah.
And so they hear that Egyptians are coming. They're like,
we're possibly cornered.
They're like, yeah, we might need to step up the speed here. So messengers from Assyria were once again sent to Judah to try to speed up the call to surrender. Because they're like, okay, things aren't going as quickly as we thought, and we just received reports that the Egyptians are coming. Hey, remember how I talked about the gods being destroyed? Like, what? Did you make a decision about that? Right? So it seems like they're kind of starting to panic here, which is foreshadowing how God is totally turning the tide. Right? So formerly, whenever Rabshakeh said this stuff, it was spoken out of total arrogance.
Yeah.
But now as he's saying it, that arrogance is still there, but you realize, like, you can see through the veneer of it.
Yeah.
Right? You're like, oh, it's just all talk. Right? And so it's weird how he's basically saying the same words, but literally the thing in between changes how you read the words.
Yeah.
Before, he was saying, oh, you think you can trust in God? And then Hezekiah decided to trust in God, and God says, I'm going to put a spirit of fear in him. I'm going to make him run away.
Yeah.
And so now, as he's saying the exact same words, you're like, I think this guy's scared. I think he's afraid. And it's just because God is like, it's just hilarious. Like, whenever you look at it, same words, totally different, and the only difference is that God changed his heart.
Yeah.
Right? And so now he's beginning to drive the guy away.
Right. And he was the one who said that God couldn't help them.
Exactly.
Which is funny, too. Like, it's very ironic, because
Yes.
he was the one who was like, yeah, Hezekiah, he can't help you. God, he can't help you. But now he has a spirit of fear because of God.
Yeah, and he's totally oblivious to the fact, right?
Oh,
he
yeah,
doesn't know
absolutely.
that God's doing this, right? He's thinking purely politically and pragmatically.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony is that it's the Egyptians who are putting this fear in him,
Mm-hmm.
which God, Judah was wanting to trust in Egypt to help them.
Yeah.
And technically Egypt is helping them,
Right.
but it's because God is
Through
allowing
God.
this to happen. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah.
So the irony is really funny. It's literally so nuanced. It's just about who is your heart trusting in.
Yeah.
Because externally speaking, pretty much all the things are the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's just about God controlling all of it. Really, it's like all the nations are just on puppet strings, and God is the one governing it in order to test the heart of his people.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And it's not really, this isn't the first time we've seen this. If you go all the way back to Exodus and God's like hardening Pharaoh's heart,
Yes.
he does the same thing, just working through the hearts of other people for his people.
Yes.
So it's kind of cool how he does that.
No, absolutely. And Isaiah is filled with Exodus imagery. So Rabshakeh returned and found the king of Assyria fighting against Libnah. Libnah and Lachish were cities southwest of Jerusalem. I believe Libnah was just a little bit north of Lachish. So basically just while Rabshakeh is confronting Jerusalem, Sennacherib's out, and he's still fighting against all these other places, just demolishing them.
Yeah.
Right? So Judah hasn't totally fallen, but Jerusalem is really their strongest point of defense right now. So he goes and he sees that, Sennacherib's over here fighting against Libnah, for he had heard that the king had left Lachish. And the king heard concerning Tirhakah, king of Cush, he is set out to fight against you, right? So Sennacherib hears, Egypt is coming, and they're coming your direction to fight. So when he heard it, he sent messengers to Hezekiah saying, thus you shall speak to Hezekiah, king of Judah, right? So he's like, oh boy, we better destroy Judah before the Egyptians get here. Like, let's get out of town. Don't let your God in whom you trust deceive you. Right, so he's received word that Hezekiah trusts in God still.
Yeah.
By promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the land of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all lands, devoting them to destruction. Shall you be delivered? He's like, are you gonna be? I don't know. Make a decision soon. Have the gods of the nations delivered them, the nations that my fathers destroyed. Right? You see the arrogance there and the pompousness, but it's just not selling the same way, especially now that we know Hezekiah's decision.
Right.
Because we know Hezekiah made the right choice.
Yeah.
Goes on, Haran, Rezeph, and the people of Eden who were in Telassar. Where is the king of Hamath, the king of Arpad, the king of the city of Sepharvaim, the king of Hanah, the king of Eva? The irony now is whenever you read those words formerly, he was saying, do you really think that your God is more powerful?
Yeah.
And the temptation was to think, I don't know, is he? But now as he's saying those words, we are literally seeing his plans falling apart. And so every single God that he lists, rather than being a challenge to God, is just a demonstration that God is more powerful than them.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So as he's listing these out, you're saying, yeah, God is more powerful than all these other gods.
Because they're destroyed and he's
They're destroyed, and you are literally getting ready to flee.
Yeah.
So it's just really ironic. All right, final paragraph. Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And Hezekiah went up to the house of Yahweh and spread it before Yahweh. And Hezekiah prayed to Yahweh, Yahweh of hosts, Yahweh Shabbaot, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim. You are the God, you alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. You have made heaven and earth. Incline your ear, Yahweh, and hear. Open your eyes, Yahweh, and see, and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, Yahweh, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations of their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire, for they were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they were destroyed. So now, Yahweh, our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are Yahweh.
It's really good.
Yeah. What do you think?
Hezekiah's a rock star.
Yeah, he is.
It's so cool how he always responds by going to prayer. That's really, he never acts immediately, but he always goes to prayer and asks for what God wants, what's pleasing to him, before he makes any decision. So that way, it's not necessarily landing on him, but it's what does God want, what is pleasing to him, and that's really cool. And then I also think it's cool how he specifically compares God to those other gods, because we just saw Rabshakeh talking about all of those different gods, and then he comes here and he said those are just gods that man has made with his own hands, with rock and stone and stuff, and that's just really cool. And he calls them like our God, and that's just it's really cool. He paints the picture of the difference between the two, and it's awesome.
What's the difference between our God and your God?
Let me tell you.
Our God isn't made with wood and stone. Our God created us. It's like you could just imagine, like, this would be a really dramatic moment in, like, a movie or something.
Yeah.
What's the difference between us and you? You know, it reminds me of I don't know if you remember this. Oh, look, now I've got a thumbnail. I can put Batman in it. Okay. You remember the Dark Knight movie? At the very beginning of the Dark Knight, he's more popular and stuff at this point. And there's these other guys who are dressing up like him, and they're trying to take down some villains. And they're like, they're like, what's the difference between us and you? And he's like, I'm not wearing hockey pants. That's kind of what Hezekiah is saying here about Yahweh, right? He's like, yeah, the difference between our God and your God is that our God's not wearing hockey pants. Right? Our God wasn't created by human hands. Our God is the creator of human hands. Yeah. Our God created the heavens and the earth. Yeah. And so if you think you can beat our God, you are mistaken. Like Hezekiah is a total superstar.
Yeah. Here. How cool. You could just go back and like quote Genesis. And just like it's really, it just all ties together and you're like, wow, how awesome.
It's great.
Yeah.
Hezekiah does not depend on Egypt. Rather, he depends upon God. Upon receiving Assyria's renewed call to surrender, he once more goes into the temple and prays that Yahweh would come to their aid, revealing his glory to all the nations by doing what their gods could not. Right? So he has learned the lesson. Yahweh is with us. God is with us. Emmanuel. He received the lesson. Let's walk through this a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up, because the video's gone a little bit longer than I intended. Yeah. Quite a bit longer than I intended, actually. Yeah. So Hezekiah received the letter from the hand of the messengers and read it. And once again, instead of just going and making a political move, he goes to God. He went up to the house of Yahweh, right? He went to the temple. He spread it before Yahweh. I love the repetition of Yahweh here, right? You see, like, the word is gone. Like, that's why I like highlighting it. Yeah. Because you see that it's gone through the rest of this, but then, like, all of a sudden it just shows up everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah.
Yeah. And spread it before Yahweh. And Hezekiah prayed to Yahweh. Yahweh, Shabbaoth, God of Israel, right? The God of angel armies, the God of our people, enthroned above the cherubim. This is a reference to the Ark of the Covenant, because the Ark of the Covenant had the cherubim on top, and God's presence dwelled there, right? Enthroned above the cherubim. You are the God. You alone, right? This might even be a reference to Deuteronomy.
That's what I was thinking.
Right? Yeah. The Lord our God, the Lord is one, right? You alone, of all the kingdoms of the earth. Right? You are the God, right? Not a God. You are not one. No, you are the God of all the earth. Not just of Israel. You are the God of Israel, but you're also the God of the whole earth. Yeah. That's a big distinction, right? All the other gods are just gods of their little places. No, he is the God of Israel and of the entire earth. You have made heaven and earth, right?
Takes it a step further.
Yes. So it's great, right? Why are you the God of all the earth? Because you made us, right? You are the creator of all things. Incline your ear, Yahweh, and hear. Open your eyes, Yahweh, and see. Like, just the repetition there is so beautiful. Incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see. He's saying, God, look at your people. Look at us suffering. Jerusalem is surrounded. The Assyrians have finally arrived, and I'm crying out to you. If I may be so bold to ask you, would you lend your ear to me? Right? Please look at us and hear all the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. He's doing exactly what Moses and David did, right? He's saying, God, remember your glory. So cool. Right? He's not saying we deserve to be he's not saying that, right? There's never a place where he's saying we deserve to be delivered. He's not appealing in any way on the people's morality. He is simply saying, hear what he is saying about you. Yeah. He is saying that you can't do it. Yeah. I believe you can. Yeah. Right.
It reminds me of David with like David and Goliath. Yeah. And just the idea of these, it's all throughout the entire Bible, these strong leaders that we see that God has put in place, that they share the same jealousy that God shares with them. And they understand that this jealousy is rooted in the sense of glorifying God. Yep. And this it's just really cool because whenever you see someone responding that way, you can see that they understand the heart of God in a different way that other people don't. Yeah. And that's awesome because you know that there's good leadership there, and that's just really cool.
I wish our ministries nowadays were more focused on that. Yeah. Because nowadays really a lot of it, just the main thing that we focus on is how much God loves us, which is a good thing, right?
He does. He does
like,
love
yeah,
us.
God
but-
does love us, and the Bible has a lot to say about the love of God.
Yeah.
But in our ministries, we mainly think, oh yeah, God will do this because he loves you so much. Biblically speaking, the best way to motivate God into action is by his glory.
Yeah.
Right? Because the thing is, God's love is going to cause him to do what he's going to do no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But he wants us, like, you know, if you don't have to ask somebody to love you, right? I mean, if you're asking them to love you, it's not love, right? God is going to love us.
He made us.
Yeah, and he already does love us, and he's already doing stuff out of love.
Mm-hmm.
If you're wanting to motivate God to action, you have to appeal to his glory.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what all these leaders do, right? It's not like, God, if you love me, you'll do this. No, that's not how love works.
Yeah. He's a God
right?
of Hesed.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
And so he's going to love you, and he's going to do that stuff. If you want to motivate him to action, say, God, consider your glory and act. And that's what Hezekiah is doing.
Align with his ways.
Yeah, hear the words of Sennacherib, which he has sent to mock the living God. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have laid waste all the nations of the land. He's admitting, right? He's like, God, I'm going to be honest with you. These people have destroyed everything.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in their path has been totally demolished. And they have cast their gods into the fire. Right? They've demolished the lands and they demolished their gods. I'm going to be honest with you, God. But the thing is, their gods were nothing compared to you.
Yeah.
They were no gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore, they were destroyed. So he says, God, I'm going to be honest with you. They've destroyed everything. But the difference is that they didn't have you.
Mm-hmm.
We've got you. Those gods, they couldn't protect them because they were made of nothing.
Mm-hmm.
You're made of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So now Yahweh, our God. You notice how earlier when he was talking to Isaiah, he was saying Yahweh, your God?
Yeah.
Your God?
Mm-hmm.
I think Hezekiah still worshiped Yahweh a few moments earlier, obviously.
Right.
But I think that it's intentional in how the
The
author
shift.
put this, right? The shift there, because he's now speaking on behalf, like he's speaking to Yahweh himself.
Yes.
He's no longer asking Isaiah to pray. He's praying himself.
Right. Right.
So now Yahweh, our God, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are Yahweh.
And there we see the motivation again, too.
Yep.
The motivation is not because, God, please do it just so that we're safe, or because we don't want to fight, or because we're scared. He says, do it for your glory.
Yes.
So that people can see who you are, that you are our God.
Yep.
It's not for their own personal gain, but it's for God's gain. And so that makes it their personal gain.
Yep.
Or at least it makes it his personal gain, hopefully the people of Judah too, once their faith is strengthened.
Yep.
But it's for God's gain, and therefore makes them feel like they have gained something too, which is just awesome.
Yeah. And one thing that I think is really cool here, I didn't look it up, so don't quote me on it, but right there it says, Yahweh our God, save us. I would not be surprised if the Hebrew word for save there is the same word from where we get Jesus, you know, because Jesus means Yahweh is salvation, right? And I looked this up earlier. This is really reading more into it than we really need to.
Yeah.
But in Isaiah 35, I don't think I mentioned it in the video, but it talked about Yahweh will save us. Like it says God will show up and he will save us. And the Hebrew word there is the same word. So it literally says Yahweh save.
Yeah.
And just kind of interesting because specifically in that context, it was talking about the Messiah.
Interesting.
And it was like, oh, interesting. Like Yahweh will save us. And it's literally that same kind of combination of words that ultimately turns into, so if Yahweh and then the Hebrew word is, like it's Shah something.
That's really cool.
But yeah, so like Shahar or something like that. I forget the exact word, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was there too.
Yeah.
Don't read too much into that. I just think it's cool whenever you see that combination of like Yahweh save, Yahweh save, Yahweh save.
Yeah.
Because it makes sense why Jesus was named that, right? Yahweh is salvation. But yeah, so his whole thing is like, save us so that everyone may know that you alone are Yahweh. I like, it doesn't say you alone are God,
Yeah.
right? There's many gods.
Right.
But
It's his
you
name.
alone are Yahweh. You are the self-existent God. You are the one enthroned above all things. He says, prove it. And I ended it there for a cliffhanger. And because I knew this video was already going to go long enough as it is.
Yeah.
Really, originally I was wanting to do all of 36 and all of 37, but we're just not going to get to that. And so in the next video, we'll actually see Yahweh's answer. And we'll actually see him run the Assyrians off. But until then, that's all we got for you today. And so thank you so much for joining me. I
Thanks for letting me
appreciate
join.
it. The video ended up being a little bit longer
Yeah.
than anticipated, but you know what?
We
I
had
think
good
it's fine. I think
conversation.
it was worth it. And yeah, do you have anything else you want to add before we wrap this up?
I don't think so.
All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for watching this. It's always good to have Brianne here with
Yeah.
us for another Isaiah video. And I guess we will see you next time. Once again, my name is David.
And my name's Brian.
And this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face. Don't let anybody steal your joy. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and meet us down in the comments to talk more about this amazing book.
Yes.
See y'all later. Bye.
Bye.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.